Sha-na-na-na, sha-na-na-na-na-na. Sha-na-na-na, sha-na-na-na-na-na. Sha-na-na-na.
It's rare to find documentaries that are this upsetting to me. Only a handful have ever given me such visceral emotional reactions. I've covered a few before, like The Titicut Follies and Caught in the Net, but other films like Dear Zachary or The Bridge are in that exact same realm for me. I'm gonna get this out of the way right now. This might be one of the most infuriating documentaries for one of the most insane stories that I have ever heard. Not to say the documentary is bad, because it isn't. In fact, it's so effective at what it does that it took me multiple days to get through this film. It may seem hyperbolic, but hopefully you'll understand what I mean by the end of this video. I'm also going to be changing up my typical formula for this video to help give context to everything. I'll be bouncing back and forth between the case and the documentary. But with all of that out of the way, welcome back to the channel. Don't forget to subscribe for more. And I'm Nightmare Movies. And today, I just want to ask one question. Who killed Vincent Chin? Let's lay some groundwork here before I get into the actual documentary. On June 19th, 1982, in Highland Park, Michigan, Vincent Chin was having his bachelor party at a gentleman's club with some of his friends. At the time, a dancer named Starlene was on stage, entertaining the group. The men wanted to give her a tip, but in her own words, the way they wanted to give it to her made her feel uncomfortable, so she turned it down. After that, two men entered the club and sat across from Vincent and his friends. Those two men were Ronald Evans and his stepson, Michael Nitz. Starlene had recognized Ronald and approached him for a dance, and once she did, someone in Vincent's group started heckling the woman. Ronald replied to the men saying, "Boy, you don't know a good thing when you see it." Vincent responded, "I'm not a boy, you know," and this is where the night took a turn. Another dancer heard Ronald yell, "It's because of you little motherfuckers that we're out of work." And keep this quote in mind for later. Now from there, the two's back and forth continued to escalate. According to the dancers and eyewitnesses, Vincent approached Ronald and the two got into a fight. Both of the men were holding chairs and Michael jumped in to help Ronald. However, this led to him being hit by one of the chairs. After a few more punches were thrown, the fight was broken up by the club's parking attendant. According to Starlene, Vincent was standing over the two men, seemingly having won the fight. Vincent and his friends left the club and were hanging out in the parking lot. Shortly after, Ronald and Michael also exited and made their way towards their car. They popped the trunk. Michael Nitz took out a baseball bat, and the two men rapidly approached Vincent and his friends. Now reportedly, Vincent yelled at the men that if you want to fight, I'll fight, just put down the baseball bat. But Ronald and Michael continued to walk towards Vincent, so Vincent made a run for it. After a small chase, the two men were unable to catch Vincent, but their pursuit didn't stop there. Michael and Ronald got in their car and started scouting for Vincent. They eventually found him hanging out at a nearby McDonald's. The two got out of their car, and once again Vincent tried to make an escape, but this time he was unsuccessful. This is where the case gets a little graphic, so I'll spare some details. The important detail though was that Vincent Chin was in a coma after the incident, so he was rushed to the hospital. He never regained consciousness. Vincent Chin passed away 4 days later, on June 23rd, 1982. He was 27 years old and 2 days away from being married. Now you might be wondering why I gave you all the case details before actually talking about the documentary. That's because Who Killed Vincent Chin is a redundant title for this film, because we know who did it almost immediately. The film lays out some of the details of the case in its first few minutes. So if there's no mystery to who did it, why exactly am I talking about this film? Well, that's a great question. 7 minutes into the documentary, Ronald Evans is sat on his couch with his wife being interviewed. Ronald Evans is not in prison. This documentary isn't about finding a criminal, it's about how someone got away with a horrible crime. Now this documentary is very non-linear. It flips back and forth between many different perspectives, from Ronald's point of view to Vincent's mother and even some of Ronald's neighbors. It's honestly a whole lot, and I don't want this to be an overly confusing video, so I'm going to focus on some of the key points of this case and this film that were the most upsetting to me. First off, I want to talk about why these two men are walking free today. Initially, Ronald and Michael were charged with second-degree murder something that would have sentenced the two to 15 years in prison. However, they accepted a plea bargain to get the charges reduced to manslaughter. The judge for their case, Charles Kaufman, sentenced them to 3 years probation, and each were given a fine of $3,000. Neither of them saw jail time. But wait, how did that happen? Well, it's a lot to unpack. In this documentary, we get interviews from Vincent Chin's adoptive mother, Lily Chin. She gives a very detailed history of herself and Vincent, and it's difficult to watch. A mother grieving for her son, but one of the most infuriating parts was when we learn more about the trial, the one that she was never told about or even attended. No one in the courts had contacted Lily about the trial, and according to her, no one else really spoke but the defendants. Starlene, the dancer that was a first-hand witness, not at the trial. In fact, none of the dancers were there. Both officers that were at the scene of the crime, neither of them were contacted by the courts. Why was this? Luckily, in the documentary, we get an answer. Judge Charles Kaufman did an interview where a reporter asked him directly, "Didn't you have the responsibility to ask for the other side of the case before you handed down the sentence?" And I want you to have a listen to his answer.
I have approximately 50 sentences every week. With 50 sentences a week, you're talking about 200 sentences a month.
Too busy at work to properly do a murder trial, I suppose. There's another clip of the judge that also sheds some light on his opinions.
Had it been a brutal murder, of course these fellows would be in jail now.
According to one of the police officers on site, he said that the way Evans wielded the bat, it looked like he was swinging for a home run. Vincent was taken to the hospital with a severely fractured skull, but apparently that is not quote-unquote brutal enough. A horrible excuse for what happened, but apparently at the time this was not an uncommon occurrence. Helen Zia, another important figure in this case and this documentary, went on an interview show to explain this.
These things happen all the time. Sure, police detectives don't even bother to ask people at the scene of the crime anything.
Now you might think that this is how this ends, but we are not even close to finished with this case. The next thing I want to address is a little history of Ronald Evans and the state of Detroit in the 1980s. At the time, Robert lived in Detroit and was the superintendent of the Warren Truck Assembly Plant for Chrysler Automotive. He also owned a local bar called Ron's Place. And the first bit of this documentary details Ronald's work environment and the political climate of the time. The Japanese automotive industry was having a boom in the 1970s and 1980s. This was causing a lot of American car plants to be shut down at the time. Chrysler was one of the biggest contributors to this shift from American to Japanese cars, and there was a rumor that Ronald's plant was going to be shut down. He was given an offer to transfer to another plant, but ultimately just left this job entirely. This shift in consumer purchasing caused a lot of tension between Americans and Japanese immigrants in Detroit because of plants getting shut down and people not being able to find new jobs. There's a good amount of context in the middle of this documentary if you're interested in the history, but the main reason I brought it up was because the case of Vincent Chin seemed to be motivated by a similar hate. Earlier I mentioned that one of the witnesses heard Ronald say to Chin, "It's because of you little motherfuckers that were out of work." This would indicate a crime of hate, and I'm not the only one who sees it that way. Helen Zia read the psychiatric evaluation of Ronald Evans, and this is what she had to say.
I did have an opportunity to read the pre-sentence report, the psychiatric evaluation and so forth. Words like Ronald Evans is a bigot, an extremely hostile person.
After the very lenient sentencing, protests began all across the country calling for a federal investigation. An organization known as the American Citizens for Justice, or the ACJ, was formed and quickly gained support. Mrs. Chin was going around the country advocating for justice for her son. And if you're curious as to what Evans thought about this,
I personally think that a lot of them used it for their own vehicle just to get ahead.
Now, all of this pain that Mrs. Chin has gone through eventually paid off. In 1984, there was finally a federal investigation and trial going on regarding the violation of civil rights. If Ronald and Michael were found guilty, both of them would face life in prison for their crime. And after a long trial process, in 1984, Ronald Evans was found guilty of one count of violating Vincent Chin's civil rights and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. But if that's true, how are we getting interviews from him for this film?
That is the cry coming from Metro Detroit's Chinese American community this evening. A federal appeals court has ordered a new trial for Ronald Ebens.
A new trial was ordered because of trial errors. 3 years after the conviction. What follows in the documentary is the final trial in the case of Vincent Chin's death. And if you're wondering what the verdict was, well, you already know the answer. Ronald Ebens was found not guilty of civil rights violations against Vincent Chin, and that day, he walked free. Now, I had to skip over other parts of this documentary to get a clear point out of it. There are numerous segments where friends of Ronald and Michael give their own opinions on the case, and you can imagine that those aren't exactly the most insightful. This is one of the most insane cases that I have ever heard of, and this documentary does an incredible job of documenting every single minute of it. It shows news reports, interviews, and everything in between to paint the picture of what happened that night in 1982 in Highland Park and how mishandled this investigation was. I highly recommend watching the full thing because I truly can't do justice to this film. If you're interested in true crime or anything like this, give this film a watch. But like I said in the introduction, this is an upsetting case and an even more upsetting film to sit through. Watching Lily Chin talk about her experience was one of the most heartbreaking things I think I have ever witnessed. And it's a tragedy what she had to go through for so long. In the end, justice was never served. And with all of that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm Nightmare Movies, and I'll see you guys next time.